Geraghty has spent over 22 plus years in leadership development, leading a team of women across the nation. She holds a degree in theater, has a background in improvisation, and is both counseling practitioner and REBT certified. Tara is a sought-after top 5 TEDx speaker, the author of Making Cancer Fun, A Parent's Guide, which is an Amazon #1 new release, and has been featured on MSNBC, GMA, 5280, Denver's Mile High magazine, and Reader's Digest, just to name a few. She is a contributing author on Every Entrepreneur's Guide to Running Your Own Business, a contributor to Conquer magazine, The Patient's Voice, and can be heard on podcasts worldwide. She volunteers her time as a member of the JLMC and the New Jersey State and Public Affairs Committee. Tara lives in New Jersey with her miracle kid, daughter Emily Grace. You can find Tara at www.taragonline.com. And now I'm going to hand things over to Tara.
Yay! Well, thank you. I'm so excited to be here, even though I said to Jesse, this is really odd virtual. It's a little bit of a strange experience, I think, for all of us. So I hope that this will work and that you'll have fun. And I appreciate you taking your time to be here and to really find out how can you support cancer families. So just like we're doing this virtually, like how many of you can say this year has totally not gone the way that you would have predicted. I heard a funny meme, and maybe you guys have seen this, it was kind of floating around, and it had that, if you were in a job interview 5 years ago, the question that everybody got wrong is, where do you see yourself in 5 years? Like, nobody got that answer right, because nobody would have said, yeah, 5 years later, I'll be wearing a mask to the grocery store, and I will be wiping down my groceries with hand sanitizer, which I will tell you I'm still doing, much to the dismay of my daughter. Nobody would have said that our kids will be doing some kind of education that I call education chaos. It's like some kind of cross between education and just complete chaos for both you guys as administrators and for parents. Or that kids would be going to college at home and their dorm rooms would be their childhood bedrooms, or that parents would be having to learn this insane second grade math that none of us understand. Or that grandparents would be trying to figure out, how do I get my grandkids on Zoom for their login for their class because the parents are working. I mean, nobody would have predicted this. And what I've seen is that for a lot of people, this year has really felt like the carpet has just been ripped out from underneath them. And the security of what life is supposed to look like is just shattered, right? And even our security of, well, what's life going to look like in 3 months or in 6 months? That is shattered. So my daughter started back to school. She is a freshman, and she had an option to kind of do this in person. It was a hybrid option, right? And so she and I did a little under-over bet, like, well, how long will this work? She goes 3 days virtual and 2 days in school. And we're like, do you think you'll be in school for a whole week, 2 weeks, maybe a month? Do you think it'll be 2 months? Do you think we'll make it till Thanksgiving? What about Christmas? Like, it was this, is this even going to work? And I got a thing from the school early on, and it was a 127-page 4-phase plan. And if any of you had to put were part of creating those for your school, I feel so bad for you, because as I'm reading through and skimming through this plan, my daughter says to me at the end, so, what does it say? And I said to her, well, the one big takeaway I have is that you don't have any lockers this year because you can't social distance in the hallways. I mean, that is literally what I got from the 127-page plan. And so it's this really scary feeling to feel like, not only is my entire world unrecognizable, but the life that I know, like, that's gone. It doesn't look the same anymore. It doesn't feel the same anymore. It's like, I'm still living, I'm still breathing, but my regular life is gone. And I have no idea of what it's going to look like in the future. And if that is what you have experienced in even just a small way this year, then you have experienced what a parent feels like when they hear your child has cancer. And that's what I experienced in 2010. I was in an emergency room when a doctor said to me, my only daughter, 3.5 years old, your daughter has high risk stage 4 neuroblastoma. And my life has never looked the same since. I'll show you a picture. I'm not a techie person, so it's not on PowerPoint, but this is a picture of my daughter when she was diagnosed. Her little, bald head. You can see my light in the background. See my light? You can see her little bald head there, but that was her at 3.5 with a nice tube in her face. And, life was thrown into this complete chaos. And so what my hope today is that I can kind of give you, number one, a glimpse into what a family experiences when they hear that diagnosis, and then also maybe some just really practical tips on how you can best support that family. And I keep saying family because I think what's really important to just right off the gate, right out of the bat talk about is what the studies show is that 25 to 35% of parents will suffer post-traumatic stress disorder, will actually have a diagnosis of PTSD after a childhood cancer diagnosis. And it really doesn't matter whether the child survives or not, it's simply that diagnosis. The siblings also have an extremely high rate of PTSD. And what's super crazy about it is that that's a higher rate than the actual patient themselves. And I think that's a really important point for us to be aware of, because as educators, when you're supporting a family or a child going through cancer diagnosis, our initial thought is, well, we need to support the patient. It's the child that's going through that diagnosis. It's the child who's experiencing that. And certainly within a school setting, your connection is mostly going to be with that child, right? So I really want to expand our conversation today that, if you've got a sibling in a classroom, that sibling is probably going to need as much or maybe even more support than the actual sibling. And the parents, they need the most. The parents need the most. Because what the studies find is that these children who go through cancer they're resilient. And you're educators, so I kind of feel like you already know that, right? And if you're a parent, you kind of know that kids are super, super resilient. Us grown-ups, maybe not so much. We're not quite as resilient. So how do you support this family? Because here's the deal, I really believe regardless of how good a family looks on the outside, no matter how much we look like we have it together and you're like, wow, they're coping really well, we don't. We are struggling, and we're struggling from a place of being afraid and terrified and living in a world that is completely unrecognizable now that our child has cancer. And so the biggest thing, and I think the biggest way to support somebody, and what was most valuable for me, was when people were super compassionate. And I cannot stress that enough, that compassion, will go so far in supporting somebody. And I get, you guys, you work in schools and you deal with some crazy parents. I mean, in 2020, there are some crazy parents, and I'm not an educator, but I come from a family of educators, and I hear the stories, I feel your pain, okay? So take those parents and now put that on steroids. That's a cancer parent. It is 10 years later, and my daughter is a survivor. I will show you, she started high school this year. And so this is her now, 10 years later. She convinced me to let her dye her hair pink at one point. I figured since she didn't have hair for a long time, I kind of went along with that, and that's something that, again, somebody might see that and totally judge here. I'm letting this, kid dye her hair pink. And I was like, well, she has hair, let her dye it pink, right? But it's 10 years later. And my daughter's not on treatment anymore, right? And she's doing well. And I may or may not be known recently to go up to strangers in grocery stores or in rest stops who maybe don't know how to properly wear a mask and have it somewhere down here under their face and be like, excuse me, your mask fell. Meanwhile, my daughter wants to hide in embarrassment, right? But that overprotectiveness, I don't know that that's ever going to change regardless of how much time passes. And so, if you've got a parent who's super snippy, who's super short, it's really not a reflection of you. It's not a reflection of the school. It's just totally a reflection of this crazy situation, this crazy world that they're having to live in. I will tell you guys, one person that was super, super helpful for me when Emily went back to school was her school nurse. And it was because she was a cancer survivor. And so she really understood my probably over the top anxiety about things. And even little things, like my daughter went through 6 rounds of chemo. She had 8 hours to take her tumor out. She did a bone marrow transplant. She had weeks of radiation, and then she did experimental immunotherapy, which are like these different kinds of chemo drugs. That was like another 6 months. It was a very long, she had one of the lowest cure rates in the childhood cancer world, right? So you've got all of this anxiety, but the bone marrow transplant had wiped out all of her vaccinations. And you have to wait a certain amount of time before you can revaccinate and all of that. So on one hand, I'm terrified not to revaccinate her, right? Because she has no immune system. On the other hand, I'm terrified to revaccinate her because she has no immune system. And so, you know, even something like that, which, you know, we've already got, you know, parents up in arms about vaccinations, and now you take this on top of it, right? And so the nurse was so great, because she never made me feel like I was being over the top or dramatic. You know, I was like, if there's strep at school, I need to know right away. If there's an outbreak at school, I need to know right away, right? And she never made me feel like I was crazy. She never made me feel like I was being ridiculously nervous. And this was back pre-COVID. So I can't even imagine, you know, a family going through that now. And it was so important because she was so compassionate, and she made me feel like my daughter's safe at school because this nurse understands. And she never just lumped Emily into, well, she's just another kid. You know, well, we need these records, and this is what the doctor requires, and this is what the state requires. She never just said, we'll just put her in there. You know, even things like scoliosis testing. You know, Em had so many doctors poking and prodding her that it was like, no, we won't do that at school. We won't do any more medical stuff at school. And working with us to understand why that was important, because she already was going to be, you know, kind of freaked out in a way that another kid wouldn't. She never just made her another kid. And that was super important, because what the messaging was that I got from her and from her school was that we are here to support you, whatever that looks like for you. And I mean, I really wish I could kind of show up today and be like, here's a step-by-step guide. When a family gets a diagnosis, you do this first, you do the second, you do this third. You know, there's no plan. There's no step-by-step guide for childhood cancer and for any cancer, right? And every family is different, and every kid is different. And you know that, right? Every child is different. Every sibling is different. You know, and the dynamics within families are different. You know, in my situation, I had a really dramatic, you know, crazy situation. I was dealing with a domestic violence divorce at the very same time that my daughter was going through cancer. And so literally the same year I got divorced was the same year she was diagnosed, within about 6 months of each other. So I brought this just really unique set of stress and circumstances to the table that was already above and beyond cancer. And so anybody dealing with my family was dealing with a whole lot more than just cancer. And I think that's important to remember, particularly, you know, with you guys as educators and everything, because often you're that first line of defense for a family. And to really be aware and to remember that, you know, we have an issue. Domestic violence is an epidemic in our country. 1 out of, you know, 4 people are going to be affected by domestic violence. So in a school system, that's a lot of kids going home to abuse. And we know that when there's a trauma, the abuse escalates. And certainly a childhood cancer diagnosis is a trauma. And so the perpetrator often, you know, heightens their abuse to the victim, because the victim is more vulnerable. They're already in a state of vulnerability. And so having that, we're here to support you, that to me was so comforting. And so some questions that I think are really easy questions to ask, particularly whether you're dealing with a family who just got a diagnosis. So maybe the kid's been in school and they just got this diagnosis, and now it's like, what do we do? Or a family that's transitioning back to school, or a little like my daughter had never even been in school, right? She was 3.5. And so going into school, and then she changed schools. We ended up moving and she changed schools. So things just like, you know, what can I do to support you? You know, how can I support you? What do you need? What does your child need? I think a really great question is, do you have suggestions on how we can help ease this transition? Because ultimately the parent knows the child the best and knows what their child needs the most. And really communicating that the door is always open. You know, there's nothing silly, there's nothing, you know, crazy. The door is always open, because sometimes, you know, we come up with a plan and we try it and it doesn't work. And, you know, making it so that it's okay if I need to call you a week later and say, hey, we tried that, it didn't really work. Could we try this instead? Or reaching out and saying, hey, I know we put this plan in place. I just wanted to check in. How is that working? You know, because it's all kind of a trial and error and figuring out what works for that kid. And a plan now may not be the same plan in 3 months. And it might be something really, really small. So like, for example, one thing that we did was when Emily went back to school initially is she got a free bathroom pass, because that was some issues that we were dealing with, and she didn't have to ask to use the bathroom. At one point she needed a water bottle because the school didn't allow you to carry water bottles, but they let her carry a water bottle. And so what was great in our situation is that the school community was, again, all of the messaging we got is we don't want to just support your child. And she didn't have siblings, but we want to support the siblings and we want to support you. Do you know how comforting it is to hear somebody say, we want to support you? You know, we're here to support Emily, but we also want to support you. Because I remember just feeling like, somebody wants to support me, you know, because I am just trying to support this child all by myself and someone is on my team. Like, that's huge. That's so huge. And I really think that when you're supporting that parent, you are supporting the child. But if we only support the child and we don't support the parent, like the whole foundation is rocky. And then there's no support there at all. And it's like, I kind of picture that's like saying, you know, well, there's this storm happening here, right? And this house, we're really afraid this house is going to fall down. So let's kind of, you know, batten down the windows and pull down the awnings and board up the windows and doors and stuff, right? But meanwhile, the foundation is completely cracking and crumbling. And that's because the parents are the foundation. They're the mirror for their children. Another thing that I found is that it's interesting how cancer is a really triggering word for a lot of people, but it really doesn't trigger kids. Like, I didn't even want the doctors to use the word cancer around my daughter when she got diagnosed. That is how crazy I was. I thought she was going to go through all of this treatment and nobody was going to say the word cancer around her. And I often wonder, like, they must have been in the back drawing straws. Like, who's going to talk to the crazy mom in like the room down the hall and explain to her that like her kid's going to hear this word cancer? Because cancer to me is a triggering word, right? Not anymore. Now it's not, but it was at the time. But for my daughter, it meant nothing. So I'll give you an example. Em started kindergarten and she wears hearing aids now. She had to take this horrible chemo called cisplatin and ended up with hearing loss. And so she goes into kindergarten and she had hot orange and hot pink hearing aids. All right. And the kids, of course, are curious. And so they're sticking their fingers in her ears and they're touching her and everything. And so the teacher said, you know, well, what if we have her come up to the classroom and explain why she has hearing aids? And was cool with that. Well, I get this phone call from this very distraught teacher because when she asked Emily, so Emily, tell the class, why do you wear hearing aids? I think she expected her to say, oh, they help me hear. And instead what she said was, because I had cancer. And that was the right answer. That is why she ended up with hearing aids. But it was horrifying to this teacher that my kiddo had dropped the C word in the middle of the classroom, like in kindergarten, right? But if you talk to my daughter, she will talk to you about cancer the way that we might talk about strep throat. It doesn't trigger her. And I've seen that true with so many of these kids. It's like, oh, cancer, right? I would say the biggest thing for her is that she doesn't want to feel different. And I have heard this over and over again with cancer kids. One of the things that did not work for us is that when she went back to school, she was on an IEP. And she was literally getting pulled out every single day. It was, you know, OT one day and, you know, speech one day and hearing the next day and whatever. I mean, literally Monday through Friday, she had a pullout. And she had this teacher that I'm sure had great intentions, but has had a lasting negative effect on her, because what he would do is that when the professional came to the door to take her out, he would stop the class and he would say, okay, everybody, let's say goodbye to Emily. Well, you can only imagine this only had to happen for a very short period of time where she was just refusing to go, didn't want to go to school, didn't want to get pulled out, didn't want to cooperate because she felt like a freak. And she's like, she was so horrified that to this day, this is a really big issue for her. She's like, I do not want to be called out in class. I don't want anybody in class to know that I don't want a teacher to ask me. And so starting high school this year, of course, the guidance counselor reached out to me, and now she's on a 504, but we were concerned with Zoom, and she's a lip reader, so how much would be lost? And I just really stressed, please let all of our teachers know the biggest thing is she does not want to be called out. Even down to like, hey, Emily, can you hear me? She feels like a freak. She's like, I don't want it to be called out. And so this one teacher, she came home from school and she said the teacher had given the kids all note cards with their names on them. And when her teacher handed it to her, she said, Em, just turn yours over on the back. Like kind of whispered it to her. So Emily was the only one who heard. And when Emily turned it over on the back, it said, I won't call you out in class, but just let me know if you can't hear. I have to tell you, I've not met this teacher yet, but she's already my favorite teacher. Because again, she's compassionate and she understands that Emily's not going to be like all of the other kids, but she's not going to make her feel different. Like what winner, right? Winner teacher, just love her. Another example is Emily a few years ago decided she wanted to participate in a beauty pageant. I did not want her to, but she really, really, really wanted her to. So she did. And she had to do a self-expression where they had to, come out. She wanted to wear her cheerleading uniform. And her coach said to her, I really think you should do something with your cancer, like your Beats of Courage, or maybe the book your mom wrote, just something with your cancer. And she refused, and she wore her cheerleading uniform as her self-expression. And she lost the crown by half a point. And the girl who won the crown, it was in the self-expression that she lost the point that made the difference. And she wanted, the queen wanted to be a vet. And so she brought live kittens onto stage. And, afterwards I said to Emily, I don't care how good you are at cheerleading. I mean, you just cannot compete with live kittens, right? But she said to me, she goes, Mom, I don't want to win a pageant because I had cancer. And I understand that. And I respect that. She does not want to be defined her whole life by cancer. And it's interesting because I'm probably more defined as her parent by her cancer than she is. So just think about that when you're working with a family. I'm more defined by her cancer than she is. For her, it was like this short season in her life. For me, it felt like a lifetime, right? I mean, now she's got to go to her survivorship programs and she's got to do her follow-up care, and she's annoyed and she's inconvenienced. Meanwhile, the kid gets a headache, and in the back of my mind, I'm like, we need to schedule an MRI, call the doctor. She's had 2 headaches for 2 days. Do we need an MRI? I mean, and it's been 10 years. So that's why it's a really different experience for the parents. I mean, when COVID hit, she was like Rapunzel. I mean, I wouldn't even let her leave the house, right? And so I don't know that it matters whether you're dealing with a family that's going through cancer now, or like in her case, in her high school, they're dealing with our family who, my daughter's not in treatment. She's not going through cancer, but she's a survivor. And so I'm going to have a heightened anxiety about her than maybe another parent would. And it doesn't matter that it's been 10 years, Now I will say that it's a little bit different. I think for sure the little kids, they do not want to be defined by their cancer. I have seen some teens really embrace that and use that as platforms and do amazing things. And even with those teams, at the end of the day, they just want to be treated normal. And so that's important too, I think, if you see strange behavior. And so what I mean by that is strange behavior. My daughter was in school, and when they were doing their reading circles, I get a phone call and have to come in for a meeting with the class because she is literally elbowing her way through everybody, knocking kids over to sit down next to the teacher. And they're like, we're concerned about her aggression, right? And I said, well, did you ask her why she's doing that? And they hadn't. They had called me in instead. And I had a hunch, but I went home and I said, Em, why are you kind of like footballing kids out of the way and wrestling them to the ground to sit next to the teacher? And she said, oh, well, if I sit next to her, then I can always hear her, which is kind of what I thought, right? It was just that she couldn't hear. And so there might be things like that that you see and you just go, that's kind of odd. Another thing that is odd is that at 3, when Emily should have been playing with 3-year-olds, and in preschools, she was playing with nurses, like her friends were nurses and child life professionals, and she was addressing them by first names. And so she, even to this day, has this very interesting relationship with authority. She doesn't quite understand why she's a kid and there's adults, and adults get respect just because they're adults. You know, because in her world growing up, it's not only do the adults around me, well, number one, they cater to me, but I call them by their first name. And I have a little bell that when I press it, they come. I ring a little bell and the adults come running. Like, that is a really different dynamic, right? And I saw this played out when she was in school, because she wears, for her hearing aids, these little FM boots. They have to put them on the hearing aid, and she'd have to put them in the morning, and then she'd have to give them to the teacher at the end of the day. The teacher would take them and then give her back the next morning, right? And so one day, I guess the teacher took them and she put them in her pocket, and I guess she forgot. And so the next time that Emily had to give her hearing aids in, she just was like, oh, no, I'm not giving those to you because you're not responsible with them. I mean, can you imagine? I'm like, oh my gosh, my kid said that, right? But she grew up in a different world. She wasn't doing it to be disrespectful. It was just like, oh, you weren't responsible. I'll keep them myself. I mean, to this day, she still doesn't understand the concept of like a kid's table at a family gathering. She's like, Mom, the kids have to sit at this thing they call it the kids table. Like, what goes on? You know, she doesn't understand that. Adults, she's always been a little mini adult. And so there might be some odd behavior. You know, now I can't speak to other people's kids. Maybe they don't have that. But my kid, you know, she thinks that she's equal to adults. And we've had lots of discussions about that. So if you see something that's like an odd behavior, or you see something you go, that's kind of weird, you know, it may be that it's actually really normal behavior that's a result of a really abnormal circumstance. And understanding that having a kid at school is going to trigger other kids who maybe have a family member who has cancer. See, my daughter didn't have any family members who had cancer, and she was 3. So again, like we talked about, it didn't mean anything to her. And now that she's older, when she meets new kids or kids that she didn't know and they hear she had cancer, they are like, you know, shocked, right? Because maybe they had a grandparent who passed away from cancer, or a mother who's battled breast cancer. And so it means something different. And she's become more aware over the last few years of like, wow, you know, cancer can really freak people out. I wish I could tell you this. It's sad to say she sometimes used that to her advantage, which is also not good. And we've had to talk about that too. You can't just freak people out and say you had cancer, but she's realizing like people are really triggered by that. And so I think when we're dealing with people who are going through cancer, whether it's adults or kids or whatever, that we have to really recognize our own feelings about cancer. And that sometimes even with really good intentions, we can say really stupid and insensitive things. So like when my daughter was first diagnosed, everybody and their mother, I mean, best intentions, right? But you know what I heard over and over again? God doesn't give you what you can't handle. And I remember it was like a stab, like a knife in my chest, like, oh yeah, I'm super strong. So, you know, domestic violence, let's throw in a little cancer. You can handle it. And it actually was really hurtful, even though I knew in my head it wasn't meant to be that way. You know, I've come since to kind of come to the realization that I think life gives you what you can't handle so that you can rely on God. And then we're in agreement. I couldn't handle much, right? I was like, all right, good. We're in agreement on that. But it was well-intentioned. I knew it was well-intentioned, but it was still hurtful. Another time I had a friend come and visit her at the hospital, and she was in the middle of getting her chemo. And so she's sitting there and she's getting her chemo, and my friend was just, you know, hand over her mouth, tears in her eyes. Oh my gosh, I can't believe she's getting this chemo. Is it painful? The side effects. I mean, it to the point where I had to have her, like, I had to say, like, we need to step out of the room, right? Because clearly she had an experience with chemo. She had an experience with cancer. That wasn't my daughter's experience. And she was, again, well-meaning. But meanwhile, my daughter's like, what is she talking about, right? And so we have to be really, really careful that our experiences are not everybody else's experience. Even my experience with my daughter, you know, I have to be very careful that my experience was my experience. That doesn't mean that even another family with the same diagnosis is going to have that same experience. You know, one thing I decided very early on was not to tell people Emily's stage. You know, she was a high risk stage 4. I mean, of all the stage, like that's the worst, right? And I knew if I said to people, oh, she's stage 4, that their response was going to be like, when's the funeral? You know, they would have her 1 foot in the grave. And so when people would say to me, oh, well, what stage is she? And I was asked that all the time. I would just say, oh, it's different with kids with cancer. They don't do it quite the same. and maybe that was just, I mean, that wasn't necessarily true. And it was a lie that I told myself, right? And maybe I did that because it helped me cope. I actually never told anybody what stage she was. I think maybe my mom and my sister knew up until she actually was fully like transferred to the survivors clinic. And then I started telling people she had been in stage 4. But I just couldn't deal with y'all's reaction. Like I couldn't deal with with people. So I say that too, because sometimes, you might have a family and they might say to you, it's a stage 4. Well, my daughter's stage 4 and she's doing great. And you might have a family and it's like, oh, well, we caught it really early. It's a stage 1 with a 90% cure rate. It doesn't make them feel any better. Their kid still has cancer, and I've seen this. People be like, oh, well, you got the good cancer. Like, no, your kid has cancer. There is no good cancer. It doesn't matter what the cure rate is. You're still scared. Like you're terrified. It doesn't matter what they tell you, right? Because even with a 90% cure rate, there's still that 10%. So that the fear doesn't change. And again, who knows the families that you're going to be dealing with and what you might be hearing, but just understanding that sometimes we can react in a way that we didn't really intend. I do want to give you guys a couple of resources that I think are really helpful. So I really approached Emily with a lot of fun. I was told that she probably was not going to survive. And so I chose very early on in her treatment that if I was only going to have a few weeks left with my daughter or a few weeks, months left with my daughter, that we were going to make it as much fun as possible. And I really ran with that. Fun became my coping tool. And I think fun is an incredible coping tool because when you laugh and you smile, you release dopamine and all sorts of yummy good things happen to your immune system. And I didn't know it at the time, but I was actually like helping her health-wise just by making her laugh so much, which is how I ended up writing a book called Making Cancer Fun. And supporting, it's really a guide to help parents support. But through that, I got to interview this woman, Karen Ridley. She is amazing. She spent over 30 years working with children in oncology. And so she did a video for us, and it's on our Making Cancer Fun YouTube. And I didn't add too much of it today because you can get all the resources there, but she did a phenomenal presentation on how to transition a child who's gone through treatment back into school. And the presentation is really for parents. However, I think that it would help anybody who's working with a family who's transitioning a child back to school, because she also talks about what's appropriate at different ages and what to know. And so I do want to share that with you as a resource. If you have a child who's coming back to school, she is a wealth of information, and she did a good 30-minute, and she did a nice presentation with PowerPoint and everything else. And if you're interested in this, we try to get on the website, if you just go to the website, there's a TEDx talk about using fun and silliness and everything going through childhood cancer. And might just kind of hopefully shift the way that people think about that. Because a lot of times we don't think of fun and cancer, right, in the same sentence. But it's a really, really powerful coping tool, and helping a child have fun when they're transitioning out of it. Because one of the things that I think all in life, right, but certainly in childhood cancer, is that we are the mirrors for these children. So whether we're a parent and we're the mirror for, how they're going to respond to that, or a teacher or administrator or a nurse, we're the mirrors. And we want to mirror that they are normal, they are okay, and we will get through this together. Like, you're not alone. We're going to do this together. I'm always on your team. I said to my daughter all the time, I'm always on Team Emily. So I asked her last night, I said to her, she's sitting there doing her, freshman homework. And I said to her, because she knows I'm talking to you guys today, I said, let me ask you, if you had an opportunity to go talk in front of a bunch of people who work in schools and nurses and guidance counselors and teachers, administrators, and you could just kind of tell them anything about helping kids who've gone through cancer, what would you tell them? So I was kind of curious. She came up with 3 things. And it was interesting because she didn't give much thought. Like, she had 3 things right away that she thought was really important for you guys to know. So 1, don't single them out. And that doesn't surprise me because that's what we just talked about, right? Don't single them out. Number 2, don't think they can't do something just because they had cancer. Okay, that's good, right? And number 3, she said, don't ever underestimate them. And I thought, and those are really good tips. And so I will add my 4th, and that anytime you're dealing with a cancer kid, or a sibling, that they are probably the bravest, the strongest, and really the most courageous human that you'll ever be lucky enough to meet. And we need to remember that with every interaction that we have with them. So I know that we want to have a Q&A. I don't know how to facilitate that. Jesse, maybe you can help with that. I know that we're on mute. So, okay, I pulled up, I see a chat box, but I do want to give you guys, oh, I didn't realize how horrible my light was. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. It looks like this is terrible. This is really terrible. And I would feel really bad about it, except as a cancer parent, you just kind of realize you just roll with it, right? Like that's one good thing. Hopefully your cancer parents are like, well, I look like I have stripes on my face. What can I do? I want to give you guys an opportunity that this is like a safe environment to ask me anything. As you can tell, I'm pretty open. So there's really nothing that would be offensive or that I would feel uncomfortable answering, but that if you're dealing with parents, you may not want to ask them because you're like, oh, I don't want to say the wrong thing or I don't want to hurt, right? Because we just talked about how people can be really insensitive. That doesn't count for this. Like you're here to be able to ask those insensitive questions so that you can feel comfortable. There's no bizarre questions. Childhood cancer is something that hopefully, it's not rare. It's the second leading cause of death in our children, and it's the first leading cause of death by disease. So it's actually not rare, but it's still something that we still think is rare. I have no idea how to get rid of these lines. So I'm just going to continue with my stripes on my face. But that must have been really interesting for the last half hour. Were they moving? Were they like moving stripes?
The sun's moving, yeah.
The sun's moving?
Yeah. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box for Tara, and we will go through and answer those. The chat box is on the right-hand side. If anyone's having some tech difficulties and you want to shoot me an email with a question, you can do that. But there is a chat box on the right-hand side. So the first
What is TE? Did I say TE? I don't know what that is, Jesse. BMT. Is that what it was? BMT, bone marrow transplant?
If
That
you
might
can
have been what
unmute
it is.
yourself, you can also ask a question live.
That'd be great. I'm wondering if that was bone marrow transplant. And a bone marrow transplant actually sounds like what I thought it was, which is like an organ transplant. It's actually not. It's where they completely drop the immune system down to zero, to nothing. And then they reintroduce stem cells into the body and basically build a new immune system. And so in my case, we were really lucky. My daughter was able to use her own stem cells because her cancer, with her type of cancer, it never went into her blood. A lot of times you need a donor, which is usually a sibling or a family member if possible. But there's also kids who literally die because they don't have a donor. So I will do my little plug. Everybody should be on the bone marrow transplant list. They literally swab your teeth, swab your mouth with a cotton swab. You go into a registry and you may get a call one day that you could save somebody's life by literally getting an IV and having them take out your stem cells and giving them to somebody who needs them to not die. So I don't know if that's what you were asking. I will say too, I'm part of some parent groups, and some things that I find really interesting is that there are parents who literally it will be years after treatment, and the day of their child's diagnosis is very traumatic to them. And these are children who survived. So, sometimes you might just have that you've got these families that there's certain days or months or whatever that it's almost like they're reliving it. What kind of services did you find most helpful for her academic needs? Thanks, Jen. That's a great question. So we did an IEP, and we had her evaluated because I was going to hold her back, and they evaluated her I was going to put her in a pre-kindergarten, and they felt that emotionally she was ready for kindergarten. So we did put her in kindergarten, and she initially was on an IEP. And what was really great was that she didn't really qualify for an IEP from an academic level. So they were able to come up with this, other box. It was other health impaired. And one of the benefits of that was that she wasn't penalized for having missed absences. because she had so many missed absences. And so it really gave the IEP team leeway to kind of create an IEP plan that was perfect for her. I didn't utilize necessarily an advocate. We worked with her case manager, who was really great. And the goal was to put her on an IEP when she was really young, so that ideally she could transfer to a 504, which is what we did. Allison said, as a child life specialist, I'm often asked to help facilitate conversations with patients and families regarding the C word. What is your advice as a parent for a healthcare professional and helping guide families towards an understanding with the term cancer? So are these families who are going through cancer? Okay, so okay, you're working as a child life specialist. So I think this was something, and I know Jesse and I have talked about this a lot, and this is something that they really tried to explain to me in the beginning, that cancer doesn't mean to them what it means to you. Like I tell you, literally, I was in the intensive care room and I'm like, you cannot use the word cancer around my daughter. I'm very big into energy and words, and I don't want to put that on her. And they must have been looking at me in retrospect like I was a, insane woman. And so I think hearing that over and over again, that cancer doesn't mean the same thing to children, was really beneficial for me. And that what was great with her child life professional is she actually came in and brought in a doll and made little tumors out of Play-Doh and explained to her what cancer was. And we actually took a very fun approach that her cancer, we never talked about her cancer being part of her. Cancer was like this separate thing. And she named her tumor. Her tumor was named Stupid Tumor, which, when you're 3 years old, stupid is a bad word. At one point, she did tell me she wanted to rename the tumor to the F word and call it an effing tumor. And I was like, oh, well, we really can't do that. I'm like, and I had to come up with why, and because I'm thinking it is, but I was like, with the tumor, we're not going to let the tumor make you sound trashy. That's a trashy word. Nice people don't use that word, and we don't want tumor to win and make you feel trashy. And she was kind of like, oh. So his name was Stupid Tumor. And so it really became this idea that it was her and Stupid Tumor, and it was like this battle between the two of them. And so when she wouldn't want to do things, I would say to her, I'm like, Stupid Tumor doesn't think you can do it. Stupid Tumor is laughing at you. Stupid Tumor doesn't think that you can handle this. And she'd narrow her eyes and she'd be like, I'm going to do it. It was just this very thing with Stupid Tumor. So I think really separating the cancer from the child was really important for us, that she didn't have cancer. Cancer wasn't part of her. It was that cancer was the separate entity that we were trying to get out, if that makes sense. And the way that they described cancer to her that I think helped was just that cancer were lazy cells, that every cell in the body has something important to do and has a job to do. And these cells, they're just lazy. They don't have a job to do. They're like these baby cells that grew up and they're just kind of hanging out, and they're lazy cells. And they're letting the healthy cells that have jobs to do, they're making them sick. They're kind of crowding their way out of them. And so we need to get rid of these lazy cells. And we did it. And I will say, I don't want to plug too much, but I will say I talk a lot about how I explained cancer to Emily and the fun things that we did about that in the book. So Marion's asking about the title, the back to school video. So if you just Google, if you go to Making Cancer Fun, there is a link on our website to our YouTube station. I don't have a ton of videos on there, but there is one, and one of the videos will say, it's Karen Ridley, and it's all about, transitioning a child back to school. And it's her PowerPoint presentation. And you can find that on the YouTube station. It's excellent. She did such a phenomenal job. What kind of support was most helpful through her treatment and diagnosis? Speaking with other parents, going through. That's a really great question, Kyle. And I will tell you, I have very mixed feelings on this. When Emily was diagnosed, so there's a great group called Momcology. And it's a support group for cancer, for parents who are going through cancer. And it was started by a mom whose kiddo had cancer. And they offer coffee chats and they do retreats and things like that. And it's all about the emotional support for the parents. I have mixed feelings because one benefit that I had was that there was no real social media the way there is now. And so I was very protected. Unfortunately, most of the families that I knew, because my daughter was in such intensive treatment, most of them lost their kids. So there was a point where I was like, does anybody survive? Like everybody I know, their kids are not making it. And there was this one little girl who was a year out of bone marrow transplant before Emily. And when I tell you, I hung to that child, like I follow her. Like she went back to school and she went back to dance and she had a normal life. And I needed to find survivors to have hope that kids could survive. So what I've seen with some of these parent support groups is that it's really great in the fact that you don't feel like you're alone. You feel like there's somebody who gets it, particularly when we're talking about this maybe over the top anxiety or over this top, like, fear that other people might think, that's crazy, where they're like, no, I get it. I get that same anxiety. Or like I just saw today a post of a mom and she said, we're 2 years into remission. And every time my kid has an ache, a pain, a hurt, I'm terrified. And how do I no longer live in this constant fear? And somebody outside of the childhood cancer world is going to maybe not really understand that, as well as obviously she posts in the group and everybody's like, we get it, right? So there's a comfort in that support. Where I also think it's hard is that it's very triggering because you hear everybody's horror stories and then you see posts on a regular basis that says, please transfer me to your bereavement group. And even for me, that triggers. And so I think it's a very fine line because I also see on a very regular basis that people go to these groups to vent. And they will actually start their post with, I need to vent. And the studies and the research in the medical world show that venting actually harms both the person who's listening to the venting and the venter themselves. We tend to think that if we vent, we will feel better. But when we vent, because we're dwelling on those feelings and the emotions, they actually don't allow us to process the emotions and move past them. And so it keeps that person kind of trapped. So there's really no positive benefit of venting. And if anything, if I'm just kind of holding it together for my kid and now all of a sudden this person goes in and vents all over the place, it's draining, right? It's like, talk about like energy draining. So I do think it's important that if you're working directly with a family also to kind of say, hey, there are support groups and there's places that you can get plugged in, but you need to know your limits and you need to know when to put your blinders on and you need to know maybe don't go in and check every single day. I have a friend who was recently, her daughter was recently diagnosed and we talked about that. And I said, maybe you need to stay out of those forums for a little while. And she did. And 2 weeks later, she said, I feel so much better. Because everybody's story is going to be different. Everybody's kid's going to be different. And it's kind of like pregnancy. You get pregnant and everybody wants to tell you about their story about how they almost like died during labor. And you're like, please don't tell me. Right. And I see that with, everyone wants to tell you their horror stories. And, so I really, I probably had the benefit of not having that and not having access to so many people. On the other side, I will say what I would look for is I would look for survivors. Like Sean Swiner, who spoke last year at this conference. To me, he is a huge beacon of hope. I had said to him, my daughter got diagnosed with restrictive lung disease, which sounds really scary. They had never used that word with me before. It's basically her lungs don't open up the way that yours and I do. And I remember saying to Tom, like, oh my gosh, she has restrictive lung disease and what is this going to mean in long term? And he looked at me and he goes, I climbed Mount Everest with one lung. I'm sure she'll be okay. And I was like, oh, okay, you're right. She'll be okay. So you need those people who are going to kind of talk you down a little bit. There's another guy, Michael Crossland out of Australia, who's an incredible speaker. And also as a survivor. And so I try to follow those people because they give me hope. And at the end of the day, I think that's what most people need, is that they need hope. It's one of the reasons we focus on our Instagram. Every Monday, we try to do a Miracle Monday. And I will say with COVID, I've stepped back. We have our next one going up on Monday, but a Miracle Monday, where we showcase a survivor, a childhood survivor, and their story, because the more parents can see those stories of hope is what we need to hold on to, right? Hope is what keeps us alive and what drives us. And I don't believe the medical stuff will work if we've given up hope. Like, we need to have hope every step of the way. So I think we're just out of time. I'm so horrified and sorry about this light. I had no idea. And I keep moving. I'm like, I don't know where to move. I can't change it. It's like, if I go this way, I don't know. Now that I'm done, I don't know what to tell you. I'm so sorry, Jessie.
Lines or no lines, Tara. We're so happy to have you.
Oh.
Thank you so much. And if anyone has any questions or wants to follow up with you, where can they find you?
You can go to Tara G online. just Tara, my name, my last initial G online. And you can, connect with me through Instagram, all the stuff, right? All the stuff, Instagram, Facebook, whatever. But please, seriously, if you have questions or you think of other questions about this conference, reach out, because I hope that I can be a resource for someone that you can really ask those tough questions and not worry that you're going to trigger or be upset. That's what I do. I talk to families and people all day long. There's nothing that you can ask me that I probably have not heard. And, somebody who's been through it, I think it does give you a different perspective, particularly we have a lot of great people on here who are amazing child life people and amazing social workers, and you guys are experts in your field. And I appreciate what you do for our community. And I still feel totally different when I talk to a parent.